Jake Callahan, a man in his late 40s, had built his life around the world of business. He was no stranger to success. With sharp instincts and a keen understanding of people, Jake had amassed wealth and influence. But one of his proudest accomplishments wasn't tied to his financial portfolio. It was Ironwood Grill, the steakhouse he owned in the heart of Dallas, Texas. Ironwood wasn't just a restaurant to Jake, it was his passion. Years of hard work had gone into making Ironwood Grill what it was today. It wasn't a vanity project or a way to show off his success. No, Jake opened the doors to Ironwood because he wanted to create something real, something special. The menu was carefully curated, every dish crafted with thoughtfulness and precision. He hired the best chefs, individuals who could elevate the dining experience with their talent and passion for cooking. The goal was simple: provide a place where families could enjoy a delicious meal together, where high-profile guests could feel comfortable and have a great time, and where anyone who stepped through the door would leave feeling satisfied and valued. But Jake understood that running a successful restaurant wasn't just about good food and a nice atmosphere. A restaurant's true health could never be measured by profit margins alone. The soul of a restaurant, the part that kept it running smoothly and its customers coming back, was found in the people who worked there. It was in the breakroom whispers, the tired sighs of employees after a long shift, and the quiet moments between waitstaff as they shared their stories. Jake knew that if he wanted to keep Ironwood running at its best, he needed to stay connected to the pulse of the restaurant, to understand what was really happening behind the scenes. That's why every few months, Jake would walk into Ironwood Grill undercover as just another regular customer. No fanfare, no announcement. He didn't want the staff to know he was there, because he knew it would change everything. He would slip in, wearing nothing more than a simple flannel shirt and jeans, blending in with the crowd. To anyone who saw him, he was just another diner, sitting at a table, enjoying his meal. But what Jake was really doing was taking the temperature of the restaurant, listening, observing, and getting a feel for how the staff was really doing. This wasn't about checking the books or reading reports. It was about getting a first-hand look at the atmosphere of his restaurant, the energy that came from the people who worked there. For Jake, it was the most honest way to ensure that his restaurant was truly thriving. It was a busy Saturday night at Ironwood Grill, and the restaurant was packed with customers. The atmosphere was lively, with waiters darting between tables, expertly balancing trays filled with sizzling steaks, fresh salads, and cold beers. The hum of conversations blended with the clinking of silverware and the occasional laughter that echoed through the dining room. It was the kind of night that Jake had always hoped for when he first opened the restaurant, full of energy, people enjoying themselves, and a staff working hard to make sure everything ran smoothly. On the surface, everything appeared perfect. The service was efficient, the guests were happy, and the ambience was exactly what Jake had envisioned when he set out to create Ironwood Grill. The staff was moving like a well-oiled machine, and the smiles on their faces gave the impression that they were proud of the work they were doing. But as Jake observed the scene from his table, something felt off, though he couldn't quite place his finger on it. He shifted his gaze, looking past the bustling waitstaff, and his eyes landed on Dean Larson, the restaurant manager. Larson was in his late 50s, with a rigid posture that seemed out of place in the otherwise relaxed atmosphere of the restaurant. He was wearing a stiff white dress shirt, his arms crossed tightly across his chest as he stood in the middle of the dining room. His eyes were fixed on the staff, but it wasn't the look of someone who was observing or mentoring. It was the gaze of someone who was controlling, scrutinizing every move, every word. Jake had seen this kind of behavior before: managers who believed that micromanaging their employees would keep things running smoothly. But it had always made Jake uneasy, and tonight, it felt even more pronounced. There was something about Larson's presence that didn't sit right, as if the energy of the restaurant had shifted from a place of teamwork to one of tension and fear. Then, just as Jake was about to brush it off, he heard it. A soft, muffled sound that cut through the noise of the busy dining room. At first, he thought it was just the clattering of dishes or the sound of someone adjusting their chair, but as he focused, he realized it was something more: a faint crying coming from the breakroom near the kitchen. Jake's stomach tightened. He knew that sound too well. It wasn't the kind of crying you heard when someone was just upset. It was the kind of cry that spoke of something deeper, something troubling. His curiosity piqued, and a sense of unease washed over him. Something wasn't right, and he needed to find out what. Jake slowed his steps as he neared the breakroom, his eyes darting to the small opening in the door. Through the crack, he could see a young waitress, Emma Reed, standing by the counter, her back to him. She looked fragile, as if she were on the verge of breaking. Her hands gripped the counter so tightly that her knuckles were white, her posture stiff and tense. It wasn't the kind of stress that came from a busy night at the restaurant. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at her. Beside her stood another server, Josh, who appeared to be in his mid-20s. He was speaking in hushed tones, his voice urgent, but his words were cutting through the tension like a knife. "You can't let him do this," Josh whispered fiercely. "He doesn't own you." Emma's face was pale, her eyes glazed over with exhaustion and fear. She barely lifted her head to respond, her voice barely audible, as though speaking took every ounce of energy she had left. "I don't have a choice," she murmured, her words trembling. "He made it clear if I don't listen, I'm out." Jake's heart clenched. He had been around enough to know when someone was dealing with a difficult customer or a stressful shift, but this was different. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This was something far darker. The way Emma's shoulders sagged, the resignation in her voice, it wasn't just exhaustion. It was fear. Pure, raw fear. Jake's jaw tightened as the weight of the situation settled over him. He wanted to barge in, confront them, demand answers, but he knew that wasn't the right move. He had to be careful. He had to understand exactly what was going on before making his presence known. It was clear now that Emma wasn't just upset or overwhelmed by the demands of her job. Something was happening behind the scenes, something that was making her feel trapped, like she had no way out. That familiar feeling of anger began to stir in Jake's chest, but it wasn't just the kind of anger that fueled a quick reaction. No, this was something deeper, something that pushed him to act in a way that would make sure Emma, and everyone else at Ironwood, was safe. He had to find out what was going on, and he had to do it fast. Jake knew that rushing in with a confrontation would only make things worse. Instead, he decided to play it smart, biding his time, carefully choosing his next move. He casually walked toward the server station, acting as though he were just another regular customer, blending in with the hustle and bustle of the restaurant. His eyes briefly flicked over to Josh, who was moving quickly between tables, but Jake waited for the right moment. As he approached the station, Jake casually asked Josh for a pen. It was an innocent enough request, one that wouldn't raise any suspicions. Josh handed it to him without a word, but as Jake took the pen, he engaged him in light conversation about the night's crowd, the weather, and the usual banter that servers would share with customers. But as Jake made small talk, his mind was racing. He had to get information, something that would tell him what was really going on with Emma. After a few moments, Jake shifted the conversation. "That girl back there, Emma, she okay?" he asked, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. Josh's posture immediately stiffened. His body tensed, and his eyes darted over to Dean Larson, who was still standing in the dining room, watching the staff like a hawk. Larson's gaze was unyielding, his arms crossed as he observed the room with an intensity that seemed to weigh down on everyone in sight. Josh's nervous glance told Jake everything he needed to know. Something wasn't right. Josh hesitated for a moment, his eyes shifting back to Jake. The brief pause between them was thick with uncertainty. Finally, Josh spoke, his voice quiet and filled with reluctance. "She's not fine." Jake's pulse quickened. He pushed further, sensing that there was more to the story. "What's going on? Is it a customer issue?" Josh's voice dropped even lower, barely audible. "It's not a customer issue." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Jake's stomach tightened. That pause, long and pregnant with meaning, spoke volumes. It wasn't about difficult customers or a bad night at work. No, this was something more insidious, something that was happening inside the restaurant, something that involved the staff. Jake's instincts told him that whatever it wasn't good. And now, he had to get to the bottom of it. Later that night, Jake stepped outside for some fresh air, needing a moment to clear his mind. The noise of the restaurant, the clattering of dishes, the hum of conversations had started to feel suffocating. He needed a break from it all. As he walked toward the side of the building, he noticed Mason, the bartender, leaning against the wall, scrolling through his phone during a well-deserved break. Jake saw an opportunity. This was the moment to get some answers, to piece together the information he'd gathered so far. He approached Mason casually, trying to keep things light. "Long night?" he asked, leaning against the wall beside him. Mason sighed deeply, a slight frown tugging at his lips. "Saturdays are always crazy," he replied, his voice weary from the long shift. Jake nodded, keeping his tone casual, though his mind was racing with everything he had seen. "What's Larson like as a boss?" he asked, throwing the question out there, hoping to gauge Mason's reaction. Mason hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking nervously toward the back door of the restaurant. His gaze then dropped to the ground, and he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. He makes Emma stay late. Alone. No one else. Jake's stomach tightened, a surge of anger rising in him. The words felt like a punch to the gut. He knew something wasn't right, but hearing it confirmed made his blood run cold. He couldn't hold back the question that had been gnawing at him. He ever touch her? Mason shook his head quickly, as if trying to dismiss the thought, but there was an unease in his eyes that spoke volumes. Not that I've seen, he said, his voice faltering. But it's the way he talks to her, like she owes him something. She looks terrified every time he calls her into his office. Jake's hands curled into fists, his knuckles turning white as the anger and frustration built inside him. He knew it wasn't just a bad boss or someone with poor management skills. This was something darker. This wasn't about misplaced authority. This was about control, about manipulation. Jake took a slow, steadying breath, exhaling as he tried to calm himself. This wasn't just a bad boss. No, Larson was something worse. A predator. And Jake knew he couldn't let it slide any longer. Jake walked back into the restaurant, his steps measured but firm. The dinner rush was finally winding down, and the once bustling dining room had started to quiet down, with fewer customers and fewer voices filling the space. There were fewer witnesses now, fewer eyes that could see what was about to happen. Jake knew this was his chance. Without hesitation, he made his way straight to Emma, who was still working behind the bar, attending to a table. She was mid-conversation with a customer, her voice steady and professional, but Jake could see it in her eyes something was missing. There was a hollow look in them, like the life had been drained away, and for a split second, Jake could feel the weight of her exhaustion. It was as if the mask she wore for the public was barely holding up, and underneath it was something much more vulnerable. He didn't waste time. I need to speak with you, Jake said, his voice low but authoritative. Emma blinked, momentarily taken aback. She looked up at him, confused, her face betraying the strain of the long night. I am with a customer, she stammered, her words laced with uncertainty. She glanced at the woman sitting at her table, clearly trying to keep things together for the sake of the service. The woman she was serving frowned, glancing between Emma and Jake with an irritated expression. She's helping me right now. You can wait, the woman said, her tone sharp, but Jake didn't even look at her. He wasn't concerned about the customer. Jake's eyes never left Emma. It's important, he said again, this time with a quiet intensity that made her pause. His gaze was steady, unwavering, and there was something in the way he said it that made Emma hesitate. She seemed to feel the weight of his words, the gravity of the situation. She looked at the woman she was serving for a brief moment, then back to Jake. Without another word, Emma nodded and stepped aside, leaving her customer for the moment. Her shoulders seemed to sag slightly as she did, as if letting go of the facade she had been holding up all night. Jake watched her carefully as she moved toward him, her face still clouded with fear and uncertainty. This was it. The confrontation was happening, and Jake was determined to get to the truth. As Jake and Emma exchanged a few quiet words, the tension in the air seemed to thicken, but it didn't take long for Dean Larson to notice. His sharp eyes scanned the room, landing immediately on the two of them. His posture stiffened, and without wasting a moment, he began to approach with a purposeful stride. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the authority in his eyes as he moved toward them. Is there a problem here? Larson's voice cut through the air, a demand disguised as a question. Emma flinched, her shoulders tightening as if she had been physically struck by the sound of his voice. She had been trying so hard to hold it together, but the very presence of her manager, the man who had been the source of her fear, seemed to drain the last of her resolve. Jake didn't flinch. He turned slowly, facing Larson with calm but commanding eyes. There was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. Just having a conversation, he said, his tone level but firm. Larson's lips twisted into a smirk, his eyes narrowing as he looked between the two of them. Emma has a job to do. She doesn't have time for private discussions, he said, his words laced with an almost condescending air. He was trying to assert his dominance, to remind everyone who was in charge. Jake caught the way Emma shrank at the word private. It wasn't just the dismissal of her as an employee, it was a subtle reminder of the control Larson held over her. Emma's face faltered for a moment, and Jake could see the weight of her compliance hanging on her shoulders. Without missing a beat, Jake reached into his pocket. He could feel the cool leather of his wallet against his fingers as he pulled it out and flipped it open, revealing his executive ownership credentials for Ironwood Grill. The moment the wallet was opened, the restaurant seemed to fall silent. The clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, all came to an abrupt stop. It was as if the entire room collectively held its breath, the tension palpable. "My name is Jake Callahan," he said coolly, his gaze locking with Larson's. "And you and I need to talk." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Larson's smirk faltered just slightly, his confidence shaken. For the first time, Jake wasn't just the owner of the restaurant, he was the man who would bring an end to the toxic environment Larson had created. The power had shifted, and Jake was no longer just a bystander in his own establishment. Jake led Larson to his office, the tension thick between them. Once inside, Jake didn't waste any time. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with purpose as he opened the recording app. With a swift swipe, he played the audio from Emma's earlier conversation, her words trembling with fear, her voice barely audible as she spoke of Larson's manipulative control. The room filled with the faint sound of Emma's pain, a stark contrast to the quiet confidence in Jake's demeanor. Larson's face went pale as he listened, his eyes darting around the room, searching for some way out. His stammering voice was almost pathetic. "Sir, I assure you." Jake didn't let him finish. He cut him off with a cold, unwavering tone. "Save it." With one smooth motion, Jake reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed HR. The phone rang once, twice, and then it clicked. Jake didn't even wait for the person on the other end to speak. "It's Jake Callahan," he said firmly. "You're going to want to listen carefully. Dean Larson is fired, effective immediately, and he'll never work in this industry again." Larson's face drained of color, his mouth hanging open in disbelief, but there was nothing he could say to change the course of events. His once commanding posture sagged, his authority slipping away like sand through his fingers. He had always been in control, but now, in this moment, Jake had taken everything from him. Larson didn't speak. He simply sat frozen in his chair, as if the words had knocked him completely out of his reality. His power was gone, and there was no way for him to reclaim it. Jake stood there for a moment, making sure Larson understood the weight of what had just happened. Then, without another word, Jake turned and walked out of the office, leaving Larson to stew in the consequences of his actions. Back in the dining area, the staff stood in silence, their eyes fixed on Jake as he returned from Larson's office. It was as if the entire restaurant had collectively held its breath, waiting for some sign, some indication that the storm had passed. Jake could feel the weight of their stares, but he wasn't focused on the eyes of the other employees, he was focused on Emma. He approached her, his voice steady but filled with reassurance. "He's gone. You're safe," he said softly. Emma's eyes welled up, tears threatening to spill over. She let out a shaky breath, her body trembling slightly as the tension of the past hours, maybe even months, finally began to release. The fear that had gripped her for so long was finally starting to loosen its hold. But then, Tyler, one of the other servers, spoke up. His voice wasn't angry, but it was firm. "This isn't just about Larson," he said, glancing at the rest of the team. "The pressure, the way we're treated. It's bigger than just this place." Mason, the bartender, nodded in agreement, his face serious. "A lot of us feel like we can't complain, or we're out of a job." Emma swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "I thought maybe this was normal," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's jaw clenched at the words, his heart heavy with frustration and determination. "That stops today," he said, his voice low but resolute. He turned to face the entire staff, his eyes sweeping over them, one by one. "I don't just want to fix this restaurant, I want to fix the system. And I'll need your help." Emma hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "And if we speak up, will anyone actually listen?" she asked, the vulnerability clear in her voice. Jake met her gaze, his resolve unwavering. "I will," he said simply, but with a conviction that carried the weight of a promise. And in that moment, Emma saw the truth in his eyes. He was going to be the one to make things right, no matter the cost. Later that night, Jake sat alone in his truck, parked just outside Ironwood Grill. He watched as the employees slowly filed out of the building, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and relief. But there was something else in their expressions, something lighter, freer. They were leaving work not just with the weight of the night behind them, but with a sense of hope that had been missing for too long. Jake's eyes followed them as they dispersed into the night, and his thoughts began to race. How many other restaurants were like this? How many other workers were out there, trapped in toxic environments, convinced they had no way out? He thought of the countless others who suffered in silence, afraid to speak up, afraid to lose the little they had. Leadership, Jake realized, wasn't about power. It wasn't about control or authority. True leadership was about responsibility for the people who worked for you, for the environment you created, and for the choices you made. It was about standing up when things weren't right and doing something to make them better. He thought about the moment when he'd made the decision to confront Larson. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was the right one. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to break the cycle. One person who's willing to stand up, speak out, and make a difference. And for Jake, that was enough. As he started the engine and drove away, he knew this was just the beginning. The changes he'd set in motion were bigger than one restaurant. It was about creating a culture, a future, where people didn't have to fear their jobs and could stand tall, knowing they were valued.